All right, good luck, everyone.
Hello to everybody that's joined us so far. We're going to give it a couple minutes just as people wander in, and we'll get started. Again, as people join, we're going to wait a few minutes to give people an opportunity to join. You are muted, so we'll explain how you can ask questions as we get going. Some more people may have joined, so just repeating for those that just came in, we'll get started in about 1 or 2 minutes. Everybody in the audience is muted, but we'll explain how you can ask questions. We'll go ahead and get started. Good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar titled Marine Reserves Essential for Conservation or a Threat to Fisheries. My name is Kent Doty. I am the Coastal Conservation Coordinator for Audubon Society of Lincoln City, who along with Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition is hosting this evening's event. A little bit on the format for our program. After introductions, the speaker will talk for about 45 minutes. There'll be an opportunity following the presentation for a question and answer. During the presentation, you can put your questions, you can type them into the Q&A chat button that's located at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded, and we're happy to have this. I hope not too many people experienced as I did internet Wi-Fi outage. Had to scramble a little bit for tonight's program, but we're all here. But if you do know of someone that missed it, it will be recorded. Next slide. I'd like to start out with the land acknowledgement statement. Before the period of white settlement, the land and waters we now occupy along the Oregon coast were home to the Tillamook and Alsea people. It is right and just to recognize these sovereign nations and to remember the dispossession they were forced to endure. Despite these losses, Tillamook and Alsea people continue to thrive and collectively act as part of the existing confederation. As we engage with wildlife and the environment that surrounds us, we pledge to learn from these nations, with the Confederated Tribes to the Silex, as well as our neighbor, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. We look forward to collaborating in many ways and common goals. Next slide. A little bit about Lincoln City. We've been serving Lincoln and Tillamook County since 2006. Our core programs are education, community science, and conservation action. We have monthly birding outings and other events. Our conservation focus areas include forest practices, rocky habitats, marine reserves, water quality, and threats to birds and wildlife, all viewed through the lens of climate change. You can learn more about us at lincolncity.org. Now I'll turn it over to my co-host, Annie.
Thanks, Kent. Hi, everyone. My name is Annie. I'm the Ocean and Estuaries Manager at Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition, and I'm also your co-host tonight. Oregon Shores is a nonprofit whose mission is to engage, educate, and empower people to protect and increase the resilience of the coast's ecosystems, landscapes, and communities. We have been watchdogs for the Oregon coast for over 50 years, protecting public access to the beaches and natural resources that are threatened from irresponsible development. Our geographic focus is the entire Oregon coast, from the Coast Range to the continental shelf. We also have a robust community science program and network of volunteers through our Coast Watch program. We host educational events like tonight's webinar, and we also conduct outreach and provide tools and resources for communities to engage in coastal conservation and advocacy. Oregon Shores has long been a supporter of our marine reserves, and we worked with allied organizations to advocate for the creation of the marine reserves over a decade ago. So we're really happy to be co-hosting tonight. Marine reserves are near and dear to our hearts. And if you want to learn more about our work, go to oregonshores.org. Thanks, and I will pass it back to Kent.
Well, I think we're in for a treat tonight. I'm really excited to have Will here with us. Dr. Will White is an associate professor at the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences at Oregon State University, and he's based here in Hatfield Marine Experiment Station in Newport. Dr. White earned his PhD at the University of California, Santa Barbara in 2007, studying ecology of coral reef fish populations. That sounds so enjoyable. He did his postdoctoral research at the University of California, Davis, and was on the faculty of the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, before coming to Oregon State in 2017. Dr. White's research group uses mathematically modeling and statistical approaches to answer basic and applied questions in a wide range of study systems, from oyster reefs to kelp forests to sea turtles. He has advised marine policy in California, Oregon, British Columbia, and was a member of the science advisory team that informed the design of California's network of marine protected areas. He's published more than 95 peer-reviewed articles, including 30 on the design and adaptive management of marine protected areas. Most recently, Dr. White led a team of university researchers that conducted the legislatively mandated review of the Oregon Marine Reserves Program. I think Dr. White and Will is extraordinary at taking very complex topics and subjects and making science approachable and fascinating for all of us. So with that, let's give a warm welcome to Will.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Kent. I really appreciate it. It's, thank you for the invitation to be here, and thank all of you who are online for joining. And I hope I live up to the introduction there. All right. And Annie, does the presentation look okay for you?
Yep, all good.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, as Kent alluded in his introduction, I find it's helpful in talking about this topic, talking about the conservation of our coastal ocean, to give you a sense of where I come from and sort of what my perspective is on marine populations, marine resources, marine ecosystems. So I began my scientific career when I was really interested in plants and forests, and I thought I was going to become a rainforest when I was a young undergraduate in North Carolina. And I did a study abroad program in Australia, in the rainforest, immersing myself in the trees. And then one weekend, I went down to, oh, I'm afraid my internet connection is a little bit bad there. One weekend, I went down to the Great Barrier Reef and went on some scuba diving trips on the reef. And I realized the ocean is way better and that I should really become a marine biologist instead. So I switched my career direction and did my graduate studies down in California, studying coral reef fish in the Caribbean. And yes, so I did spend 4 summers in the U.S. Virgin Islands, scuba diving basically every day and spending time watching little fish eat things and eat each other. And I think everyone I've ever told that to says, wow, that's a really tough life. And yes, like it was really enjoyable. But I did, produce a lot of interesting science. Along the way, though, I realized that there was a lot of power in using mathematical approaches to understand the things that I was seeing in the field. And partly that happened because I would often go down and spend an entire summer diving, and a hurricane would come through and destroy my entire experiment. And then I'd come back to graduate school in California and realize that I had nothing to show for all that work, but I could still do math. Like the math was not affected by hurricanes. So that sort of cultivated that desire to think about the way we can combine natural history and mathematics to understand things that are going on. That then led to an opportunity to begin participating in using ecology and mathematical theory to inform public policy. And so that the way we do that is using mathematical models to make predictions about what's likely to happen in the future if we take a particular management action, what's going to be the consequence of that for a fish population or for a kelp population. If we have a data set that spans many years, can we fit a mathematical model to that data set to understand what the trends are and what's likely to happen in the future? And that becomes very important when we begin thinking about managing marine ecosystems, because we're dealing with large and complex systems and people's livelihoods and our own interests in what's happening in our coastal ocean. And we don't necessarily want to just do experiments. We want to have an idea of what's likely to happen if we do certain things. And so that's the approach that I take in my science to informing how we understand the way different types of management are likely to affect the coastal ecosystem. So that brings us to thinking about marine reserves, which is today's topic, right? This is extremely timely here in Oregon, because as Kent said, and as Annie said, we have here in Oregon just gone through a whole process where there are 5 marine reserves in Oregon and their associated marine protected areas, which with each of those 5 reserves, these were all put into place after a series of executive orders and legislation that culminated in 2012 with a Senate bill that said that Oregon should enact 5 different marine reserves. And they range up and down the coast, all the way from Cape Falcon down to Redfish Rocks. And part of the legislation that enabled those marine reserves said that they should be evaluated after 10 years to see if they're meeting their goals. And so in 2021, the Oregon Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, which manages the reserve system, produced a report discussing in extreme detail all of the different aspects of the marine reserves that they've been studying over those 10 years. And that includes not just the ecology and what's happening in the water, but also the human dimensions of that, of the marine reserves. How are local economies affected? How are fishers affected? That sort of thing. They produced that report, and then part of the evaluation process that was mandated by the state was that then one of Oregon's public universities should evaluate ODFW's report and then make recommendations to the legislature for what should happen next. What's the future of Oregon's marine reserves? And so there was a competitive application process, and I ended up being the professor that was chosen to lead that evaluation effort. So I assembled an interdisciplinary team that reviewed the ODFW report, and we wrote a report that essentially concluded that yes, they were meeting their goals. They had designed the reserves effectively, and they were monitoring them effectively, but the legislature should provide additional resources. And so we made a recommendation to the legislature that there should be an adaptive management plan, a way of monitoring going into the future what's happening in the reserves, and making management changes as necessary to make sure that they are meeting the legislative goals that have been set forth, and to increase funding for the Marine Reserves Program to make sure that we're correctly and thoroughly assessing the human dimension aspects of the reserve program. How is it really affecting the people who live on the coast and the people of Oregon as a whole? That recommendation got turned into a bill that actually just was passed by the legislature in the short session. Sorry, that was HB 4132. That's currently on the governor's desk awaiting signature. So this is a very timely topic, thinking about marine reserves here in Oregon, but also globally. There's a United Nations effort, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which has been signed by most of the nations of the world, includes now a commitment as of just 2022 that we will protect at least 30% of the ocean in fully and highly protected areas in order to achieve conservation goals. Okay, and so there's now this global effort to set aside more of the ocean in some form of protected area. Okay, this is commonly called the 30 by 30 initiative, or the 30 by 30 goals. The idea that we set aside 30% of the ocean by 2030. The USA is not a signatory to this particular treaty, or it's not been ratified anyway by the US. But President Biden has said that the US will strive to achieve that 30 by 30 goal. And some individual states have also said that they will try to achieve 30 by 30 within their own state waters. So California has done that, for example. And so moving forward, we're going to see more and more interest in knowing what protected areas do, how protected areas affect other uses of the ocean, like fisheries, wind energy, potentially, right, as part of this conversation. And so this is just a broader conversation about the spatial management of the ocean and how do we decide what uses we're going to have in different parts of our coastal waters. We should back up a little bit and just talk about what the definition of a marine reserve is. This is the definition that I modified from the IUCN. This is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And basically, it's a place in the ocean where you can't have certain types of uses, right? Where whatever governing body controls that part of the ocean is prohibiting certain things from happening in order to achieve some type of goal that's related to conserving the ecosystems, maintaining what we call ecosystem services, like the things that nature does for us, and protecting cultural values. In some cases, there's a desire to, even though you're prohibiting fishing inside the protected area, potentially enhance fishery yields outside. And I think this definition comes from a place of thinking that in a lot of contexts, we've over-harvested our marine fisheries. And so by setting aside particular areas, we could allow those fish populations to build up inside of them and then produce larval fish that would sort of spill over and replenish fisheries outside, or adult fish that would spill over and replenish fisheries outside. Okay, so that's the very complex definition. In general, we're thinking about a place in the ocean where you can't fish and you can't do mineral extraction and you can't modify the seabed and things like that. Typically, there's a term that's marine protected area, or MPA, that's a part of the ocean where some type of usage is prohibited. And then sort of a subset of that is marine reserves, which is a fully no-take protected area where you cannot fish at all. And that's the definition that Oregon uses as well, where we have marine reserves where there's no fishing, and there's protected areas that are adjacent to the reserves where other types of uses are possible. Okay, so now that we've defined what we're talking about, what I'd like to talk about for the next few minutes is, what do we expect to happen when we designate part of the ocean as a marine reserve? What is that going to do, right? And this is all part of the management process, because in order to decide if we're meeting our goals, we have to know what we expect to have happen. Right? So what happens when you stop fishing a fish population? Well, let's first think about what fishing does, right? In general, when we're fishing a population, there's some age of fish or some size of fish where fishing starts, right? They have to get big enough to bite the hook, or they have to get big enough to get caught in the net. And so if you're fishing a population, you're removing fish of that size or age or larger. And so in this graphic, what I'm illustrating is the age of fishes in a given population on the horizontal axis, and then there's sort of relative abundance in the population on the vertical axis, right? So we have lots of young fish, and then as you go forward in age, there's fewer and fewer and fewer, because fewer fish survive to old ages, right? Well, if there's fishing, then you see a pattern that looks like the top panel and looks like the red line, where there's some age at which fish become big enough to get caught, and then we have fewer of those fish that are older than that, because they're being harvested, right? We're taking them. Once we've protected a location in a marine reserve, that process stops happening, right? Those fish can survive. And so after many, many years, you'd get a picture that looks like the bottom panel, where we now have many more fish of older ages. We've sort of filled in that gap in the age structure. The trick is that takes time, right? It takes 1 year to get 1 year older, right? Which, as someone who turned 45 last year, I'm glad that it takes time to get older than I am, right? But that can also be frustrating from a management perspective, when the management action we've taken will take many, many years to see the success of, right? Especially here in Oregon on the US West Coast, we have a cold ocean where we have slow growing fish that can live many, many years. And so it can take a long time to see that build up. And so here's an example of the kind of prediction we might want to make about what's likely to happen when you stop fishing. And so what's happening in this graphic is I'm showing on the x-axis now time after you've put into place a marine reserve, and the population density in that reserve. And I'm expressing this as the abundance of fish, and just in terms of numbers of fish in a given year relative to how many were there right before the reserve went into place. And so in general, you stop fishing and you get more fish, right? Because you've stopped taking them out of the ocean. But the amount that you get, the relative amount you get, depends on how much you were fishing beforehand, right? So don't worry too much about the numbers here, but the idea is that the blue curve represents a high fishing scenario and the red curve represents low fishing. The idea being that the more intensely you were fishing before the reserve goes into place, the more of an effect you're likely to see afterwards, right? This is one of these results that probably seems a little obvious after you say it, but is an important thing to make predictions for what the likely success of a reserve is going to look like. And so here's an example, not in Oregon, but down in California. So in California, in Central California here, so here we're looking at the central region of California. And so in this map, this is Monterey Bay. So the city of Monterey is right here, and the city of Los Angeles is down right about here where my cursor is. And in 2007, California put into place a number of different marine protected areas, including some no-take marine reserves along this section of the coast. And one of those protected areas was here at Point Lobos, which is quite close to the Monterey, and here's Carmel. So a lot of people live here, and there's a lot of fishing boats there. And then another reserve was down at a place they call Big Creek, which is along the Big Sur coastline. So it's fairly remote, it's hard to get to, and there are not a lot of fishing harbors nearby. And in an analysis that I did in collaboration with, she was then a postdoctoral researcher, Carrie Nichols, and a number of researchers at UC Santa Cruz, they had been collecting data on fish populations in these areas before those reserves went into place. And for example, one of the most abundant fish in that part of the world, on rocky reefs, also in Oregon actually, is blue rockfish. Up here we tend to have more deacon rockfish, but they're very similar species. And so they were collecting data on those blue rockfish before the reserves went into place, and then after the reserves went into place. And what we were able to do is fit mathematical models to those observations of the fish abundance and the abundance of different sizes of fish to estimate how much fishing there had been before the reserve went into place, which would tell us how much of an effect we'd like to see, or we'd expect to see, after the reserve stopped fishing. Okay. And so in those two locations at Big Creek, we estimated that that population had hardly been fished at all. There were lots of big fish there already, indicating that there had been very little fishing. Whereas at Point Lobos, we estimated that there'd been pretty intense fishing beforehand because there were very few big fish. And so we could turn that estimate of how much fishing there had been into a prediction for what we'd expect to see after the reserve went into place. And what these graphics are showing is the time after protection in years, right? And then the expected population density. And here the units are basically how many fish are you likely to see per, I believe the units are per 60 square meters, because that's the size of the survey transects they do when divers go down and count the fish. And the red curves are showing what we expect if the reserve actually is doing its job and limiting fishing and allowing fish populations to build up. And the blue curve is showing what happens when we expect if fishing had just continued at the same rate that it was going before. And then these sort of shadows around them are showing our estimates of uncertainty. Right? At Big Creek, those two things overlap exactly because there was so little fishing. So you don't expect things to change. And then these points here and the error bars around them are actual survey data that were taken after the reserve went into place. These data didn't inform our models at all. We just overlaid those points afterwards to see if we matched if our predictions actually matched what happened. And the blue points are from a fished area right next door to the reserve, and the red points are from the reserve. And in this case, those points are all very much overlapping and sort of in the same ballpark as our model prediction. Up at Point Lobos, where there was a lot of fishing because you're right next door to Monterey Bay and there's lots of fishing boats there, what we predicted is that there should be, eventually, there's going to be a time lag. It was going to take time for this effect to happen. There was a time lag, but eventually we should see the population increasing quite a bit, more so than it would increase if fishing had continued. And the data, sort of inside and outside the protected area, seemed to match that, where we predicted there would be a dip initially because of some reasons of things that had happened in the population before the reserve went into place. There'd be a dip, and then eventually we'd increase, and we see that in the data too, that we're increasing in the red part where there's no fishing, and the blue part is kind of staying the same and not changing as much. So this is great because we were able to set expectations for what's likely to happen, how big is the effect going to be, and how long is it going to take to see that effect, right? And in this case, we say that we're not likely to see an effect distinguishable from what would sort of a business as usual policy would be for more than a decade, right? These little shadowy areas are overlapping quite a bit until you get to be about 20 years out. So it's going to take time because these fish grow really slowly, right? Okay, this is an example in two really specific locations. We can zoom out a little bit and say, globally, do marine reserves work? Do you get more fish in marine reserves? And these are some results that answer that question from a global analysis. This is called a meta-analysis, where some colleagues of mine went through the scientific literature, and found every study that compared abundance of fish inside a reserve to someplace nearby outside a reserve, or inside the reserve to what it was like beforehand. And they measured the change in fish biomass, in fish density, that's just number of fish per unit area, in fish size, and in species richness, just how many fish species are there. And they found that by and large, there were positive effects. So much more fish density inside than outside, much more biomass inside than outside. There are a few examples where there was actually the reverse, where there was less. And we think this is likely because either the reserves were not effective, like they weren't enforced, there was poaching, or the studies didn't wait long enough after the reserve went into place to measure that effect. Some follow-up studies have then asked, what makes reserves effective? Why are some of these points way up here at there being 3,000% more biomass inside the reserve relative to outside, and some are 5%, right? What makes that big difference? And biologists love acronyms. We like to come up with catchy acronyms. And the acronym that these scientists came up with was NEOLI, which I don't actually think is that catchy because it's kind of hard to say, but that's the one they came up with. And this refers to the 5 properties of marine reserves that they found predicted really, really good outcomes. And those were that the reserves are no take. Okay, so they don't allow any take whatsoever. You can't fish for some things, but not others, all that. It's just nothing. They were actually enforced. They were old, right? So it takes time. They were large. And the reason that having a large reserve is important is that fish move around, right? They have home ranges and they might spend some time in one area and then decide to spend Tuesday over here. And if Tuesday's little over here jaunt is outside the reserve, then they can get caught, right? So having a big reserve encompasses more fish. And they were isolated, and that really just means that they're kind of far away from people, right? And so those are the features of reserves that seem to predict really good success. And I want to say that all of this science that I've talked about so far for what kind of expectations we should set for reserves was something that was really thoughtfully adopted by ODFW when they were developing their report about the marine reserves in Oregon that then went into our assessment, where they looked at each of those 5 reserves and said, okay, how much fishing was there in this reserve beforehand? And what does that tell us about what sort of changes we should expect to see? What kind of fish live in this reserve? And what does that tell us about how long it should take to see effects? And in their case, they were mostly saying, we're dealing with things like these rockfishes that live off the coast of Oregon that live 40 years, 100 years. So it will take longer than 10 years to see a big change in that type of population. Many of the reserves are fairly small and also were put into places where there wasn't a lot of fishing beforehand. So we don't expect to see big effects, even though we can expect to see some benefits to those populations that are inside those reserves. Okay, this is just asking about, do we have more and bigger fish inside the reserves? The next kind of question that people tend to ask about marine reserves is, what else can they do for us? And particularly now, as we face increasing disturbances from climate change, there's this desire to say, well, maybe marine reserves could be something that's part of a climate change solution, a climate adaptation solution. Can they provide resilience, right? Can they help us make our ecosystems more resilient, right? And so a few years ago, I was part of a working group down in California that sort of sat down and said, like, okay, well, what do marine reserves do? What are the consequences of not fishing in a location, of not disturbing the habitat in the location, and how would that translate into a benefit relative to climate change? And so the things you have to keep in mind when you're asking that question is, first of all, was that area fished very heavily? If it wasn't, then not a lot's likely to change. Is the species that you're interested in protecting likely to benefit from protection? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. And so one example of how protected areas can be a real benefit is that in the case of some abalone species, pink abalone, and this is a study that was done down in the Sea of Cortez in Mexico, where there's a fished area and there's a nearby reserve. And the fishing in this case was focused on these abalone. And so in the reserve, you had more larger abalone. And these scientists, this is led by Theo McKelly, who's a scientist down at Stanford University. They had been surveying this population starting in 2006, and it turns out in the summer of 2008, just following their survey, there was a big hypoxic event. So there's a big dead zone that formed, and that killed a lot of abalone in the area. And it turns out that larger abalone were more resistant to dying from hypoxia. And so in the reserve, after that death event, you had more large abalone. That's what's shown in the black area. The reserve protected those abalone from dying due to hypoxia because the abalone were able to grow bigger in the reserve and they didn't die. And it turned out that I'm not going to show the graphics here, but those larger abalone in the reserves then reproduced and helped sort of reseed and recover the area that had been fished and that had been depleted by the hypoxic event. And so this is one example where the effect of protection, allowing large animals to grow up in the reserve, has a climate benefit, right? And that could be a general principle that larger animals provide a benefit sort of disproportionately so. And so this is a study that just came out back in 2019 that basically showed that bigger fish are extremely valuable to the population. The term that gets used here is hyperallometry. Basically, in fish, the number of eggs you can make is usually proportional to your body size. Okay, so big fish make more eggs. This study found that it's not just directly proportional, that 5 kilograms of a large fish can produce more eggs. Sorry, one large 5-kilogram fish can produce disproportionately more eggs than 5 1-kilogram fish. Okay, so it's not just a linear relationship between how big the fish is and how many eggs they can make. Bigger fish just make a lot more eggs. And so what they calculated is, given a difference in fish length inside and outside the MPA, so fish live longer and they can get bigger inside a protected area, they would have more biomass. So here, a 28% difference in fish length inside a protected area would translate to a 100% difference in fish mass. But then the reproductive output that's equivalent to that, or that results from that, is even greater. And so you might even have a 175% difference in terms of the amount of eggs, of fish eggs that are made inside the MPA. And these two rows refer to different mathematical assumptions you make in making the calculations. But in either case, it's a lot more. And so this is the idea that just by protecting fish and allowing them to get old and get big, you get a lot more juvenile fish. And so if you have some sort of climate disturbance, the fish that are surviving that are large can make more babies to replenish the population. There are also other examples of how protecting an area can lead to climate benefits, right? In some cases, you can have a better capacity to resist invasive species, all right? So this is a story from down in Southern California. So in California, they have a different species of kelp than we have here in Oregon. It's Macrocystis, not Nereocystis, and this is a picture of a Southern California kelp forest. And California's kelp forests are facing a number of threats, and one of the threats that they're facing is this invasive species. So there's this different species of kelp called sargassum that is not native to the west coast of the US, but it grows fast and it can outcompete our native understory kelps. So of course, our kelp forests typically have these large giant kelps, or here in Oregon, bull kelps, but then there's lots of other smaller species of kelp that grow down in the understory. Just like in our terrestrial forests, we have the trees and then we have the bushes and shrubs and things underneath in the understory. And this sargassum is a very weedy kind of kelp species, and it's invading and excluding a lot of our native understory kelps. Well, it turns out that if you have a healthy giant kelp population and a healthy native kelp, native understory kelp population, you can resist that invasion. And so in marine reserves in California that are old, so California has a few marine reserves that were formed back in the 1970s, and those very old reserves have very large fish and large lobsters. And there are some species of fish and lobsters that eat sea urchins. Sea urchins eat kelp, right? And so those reserves that had a lot of urchin predators had suppressed urchin abundances. And so there was more of the native kelp when this invasion started, and they were able to competitively exclude the sargassum invader. In non-marine reserves, where you didn't have big lobsters because we had fished for them, or you didn't have big California sheephead because we had fished for them, there were more sea urchins, there was less kelp, and the sargassum could get a foothold and could invade and take over. So there's a story for how, because of interactions in the food web, reserves can be resilient to a human-caused disturbance, because of course sargassum is invasive because humans introduced it accidentally. Food webs and marine reserves can also help marine ecosystems be resilient to epizootic diseases. So many of you might be familiar with the sea star wasting disease. That was a Pacific coast-wide disease that wiped out a lot of our sea star predators over the past decade or so. And one of the important sea star species that was really affected by this was the sunflower sea star, which is shown in happier times here, which was really abundant all along the US West Coast and is a really important sea urchin predator, right? So these guys went away, and then urchins could kind of take over and graze down kelp forests. So when that sea star wasting disease happened, this is again a story from Southern California, there were locations that were protected inside marine reserves, and so you had larger fish predators of urchins and larger lobster predators of urchins, and they were able to sort of step in and replace the sea stars that were lost and keep eating sea urchins and keep the sea urchins from going out of control and eating the kelp. In places where there was fishing and you didn't have large California sheephead and you didn't have large lobsters, the loss of the sea star was more catastrophic and you had a bigger loss of kelp, right? This handsome guy here, this is the California sheephead. It's a wrasse. It's a very cool fish. It changes sex, starts off life as female, becomes male. That's a totally different webinar. But they are also, you can see they have a big chompy mouth with big teeth, and so they chomp on urchins when they get to be that big. Another benefit of marine reserves is that they protect the habitat. Okay, so this is a picture of a deep water coral habitat up in British Columbia. And so this is a coral. We think of corals as being tropical usually, right? But it turns out they also live in cooler waters, typically down deep. Tropical corals live near the surface, right? And they have little algae within the cells of the coral animal that photosynthesize. And so they make these giant reefs because they can use the energy of the sun to photosynthesize and they grow. These deep water corals are quite pale, right? These are not colorful like corals in the tropics. And they feed on detritus that's sinking down from above, but they are effective at that and they can grow and become a habitat down in the deep. So here's this deep water coral that's on those sort of softer sediment. And you can see that all these animals are attracted to this structure, attracted to this habitat. Animals like three-dimensional structure because it gives them a place to hide from predators, and it gives them a place to find food for themselves. So there are all these rockfishes that are hanging out here, all these urchins, and here some kelp has drifted down from shallower waters, and I'm sure all these urchins are enjoying this kelp. And so in British Columbia, it's become very important to put in protected areas to protect these types of habitats from trawling. Because if you're trawling for fish along the seabed, the trawl nets will destroy this habitat. And so that's another consideration, is that you can protect habitat, and that habitat can promote biodiversity and enhance fish populations. So far, I've only been talking about the good things that reserves do. They make more fish, they make bigger fish. They can provide resilience in some contexts, not in all contexts, but sometimes they can if it's particular, if it's a food web that can benefit the population, can benefit the ecosystem against climate change effects. But there's also a question about how does this interact with fisheries, right? When we close off part of the ocean and prevent fishing there, it stands to reason that that would not be great for the people whose livelihoods or whose recreation depends on catching fish, because you can't catch fish there. So one question is, can reserves benefit fisheries because you make more fish inside the reserve and those fish sort of spill over, either as adults that are just sort of wandering out and getting caught, or by making more larvae that the larval fish then go up into the water column and swim around in the plankton for a while. Maybe they land in fished areas and then they can get caught. Or are they just a pure harm to the fishery because we're closing off fishing grounds? This is a hard question to answer, right? And it's hard for a few different reasons. One reason it's hard is that when you catch a fish, you can't tell where it came from, right? The fish doesn't come with a birth certificate that says, I was born in this marine reserve and now I've landed here and you caught me, congratulations, right? We can't tell if we're getting more fish because the marine reserve was there. It's also the case that when you put a marine reserve in, other things change that could affect how many fish you're catching. There could be other management actions that change regulations and make it harder or easier to fish, or market forces that make it more profitable to fish for different species. And so this is a really hard question to answer, and also one of the most important questions to answer in the science of marine reserves. I'm going to show you a few examples where we're pretty sure we have evidence that the reserves could be benefiting fisheries. This is a study from South Africa. This is work that was done by Robin Pelk, who did her PhD in the same lab I did. And she was interested in this spillover effect in a study species that's these mussels that live on the rocky shores of South Africa. Okay, so the mussels are, of course, sort of they glue themselves to the rocky shore. The mussels don't move once they're adults, but when they reproduce, they make larvae that are up in the water column. You know, when it's high tide, the mussels spawn and they release their eggs and sperm. The eggs and sperm meet, they make eggs. The eggs turn into larvae, and the larvae spend a few weeks in the water column moving around before settling back to the intertidal habitat. And so they might not settle back to the same place they were born. They might disperse along the coast a little bit. And what Dr. Pelk did was she went to 3 different protected areas in South Africa, and she measured the settlement of little baby mussels. So she put out little collectors. It turns out that mussel larvae like to settle in the little threads. So if you've ever seen a mussel, you know, it has these little threads that it uses that come off the bottom of the shell that attach to the rocky shore. They're called byssal threads. And little baby mussels like to settle in that area because they know, oh, I'm settling in amongst my relatives and I'm going to be in this mussel bed and I'll grow up and I'll be successful. It turns out, I'm sorry to say, the mussel larvae are not super smart. And so you can fool them very easily and trick them into settling in a different type of habitat. And if you get a little toughy little scrubber brushes that we use to clean our dishes, kind of seem to a mussel larvae like they are adult habitat. And so you just put those out, you know, you screw them into the rock, and now you have a collector, and the larvae will settle to that. You can then go unscrew the bolt, take out your tuffy, shake it out in water, and count how many larvae you got. So that's what Robin did. And she did that at different distances away from each of these protected areas. So in these graphics, I've got distance away from the center of the marine reserve. The gray is showing you the sort of the boundaries of the reserve. And these dots are showing the abundance of mussel larvae, and then the blue curve is just the statistical fit that she did to that curve. And so in the first two protected areas, she found that there was this gradient, that you have a lot of larvae being made in the MPA and a lot of settlement inside the MPA, and then fewer as you get further away from the MPA, which suggests that the MPA is succeeding in making lots of mussel larvae, and then those larvae are spreading out to the edge, but the further away you get, the less that effect is. That worked, except for the third protected area. There was no gradient whatsoever. You had just as many larvae settling inside as outside, so it looks like that reserve's not providing any benefit. Well, it turns out that's one where there wasn't really anybody harvesting the mussels outside the reserve. And so because there was no harvesting, we don't really expect the reserve to provide any additional benefit. It's just sort of business as usual. And so that's the big lesson here, is that you see a bigger spillover effect the more intensely you're harvesting the population that's outside the protected area. In another example, a little closer to home, this is back to California on the Monterey Peninsula. Some scientists at UC Santa Cruz wanted to know, are fish that are born in MPAs, in marine reserves, moving to fished areas? And so they went out and collected lots and lots of adult fish, and this is the kelp rockfish, this handsome fella here. And they basically went out and caught a bunch of these fish. They took a little clip of their fin and then let the fish go. And they used that clip of the fin to develop a genetic fingerprint for each individual adult fish they caught. They then went back and caught baby fish. And they took little fin clips of the baby fish as well and did parentage analysis to match up the babies to their parents. And they did this for 6,000 fish. And of those 6,000 fish, they found 8 pairs of parents and offspring where they could match up. Okay, this fish was spawned from this parent. And, and this is because there's lots and lots and lots of fish in the sea. And so just sampling a few at random and hoping to find a parent offspring pair there's low odds, right? So they were pretty happy that they found 8. But of those 8, they found that they were dispersing all over the place. So the way this map works is that the green dots show where adults were sampled, and then the arrow is showing you the direction of where their offspring was sampled. And so we have examples, and then we have, in California, there's sort of 2 different flavors of protected area. We have marine reserves where there's no take, those are in red. And then in blue, there's fishing for some species like salmon, but not fishing for kelp rockfish. And so this is an example of one where the adult was in this protected area and its offspring ended up in a fished area. And then here's adults that were in this protected area here in Carmel Bay, and some of their offspring ended up in other protected areas, or in the same protected area. And so this is just showing that even with this fairly limited data, we can see that there are fish that are being born inside protected areas that are going into fished areas. It's definitely happening. It's not, there is this sort of spillover. It's just hard to measure. Now, how does that spillover translate into actual fishery landings? Are there actual benefits? And it turns out that the answer varies a lot. It depends a lot on the management context and the fish species in question, okay? So on the Great Barrier Reef, there was a big rezoning of the Great Barrier Reef back in 2004, I want to say it was, and they increased the area of the reef that was devoted to protected areas. And following that reorganization and that increase in protected areas, there was a decrease in landings, okay? And the main fish species that is of concern in the Great Barrier Reef in terms of fisheries is this fish. This is a grouper, we would call it. This is called a coral trout. Australians, and I say this having worked with a lot of Australians, the Australians like to name things after fish that they knew from like Great Britain or from North America, but they apply those names to totally random things. So this is not a trout at all, even though it's called a coral trout. It's what we would call a grouper. Australians call groupers gropers, which is awkward. But anyway, this is a coral trout, is what we'll call it. And it turns out that landings of coral trout were reduced after the Great Barrier Reef was rezoned and had more protected areas. But you can't necessarily attribute that to just the change in protected areas, reducing the amount of fish that you catch, because at the same time they put the protected areas in, the Australian government also did a big buyout of the fishing fleet and basically paid people to stop fishing and, paid them to change into a different industry. So there was a reduction in fishing effort as well, which would also lead to a change in fishery landings. So in that case, it seems like they knew that there was going to be this big hit to the fishery potentially, and so they just reduced how many people were able to fish, and that helped the economy not be too affected. Okay, an example from the USA, in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands and the Papahanaumokuakea protected area that was put into place by President Bush and then expanded by President Obama, there wasn't really a lot of fishing happening in that area, especially for the longline fishery for yellowfin tuna would be the main one of the area. And there just wasn't a lot of fishing effort inside the zone that was closed off. And so economic analyses have shown that there wasn't a big negative effect of that designation on the tuna fishery. Basically, it was not a big deal because the fishing vessels weren't really going in that area anyway. And then there's also been positive outcomes where one of those reserves in South Africa that I was talking about earlier with the mussels was also a reserve for fish. And some scientists have found that there has been increased catch per unit effort of this fish. This is what the South Africans call a Roman fish. It's a kind of sea bream. And they were catching more of them near the boundaries of the reserve. So clearly the reserve is building up fish biomass, and then those fish are leaving the reserve and getting caught, and that's benefiting the fishery. So whether you have a negative fishery effect or a positive fishery effect really depends a lot on how the management works and what the biology of the fishery is. In general, we can imagine how the outcome of reserve implementation would affect fishery landings just with this sort of simple cartoon. So I could have written some mathematical equations to make this like sort of an official model, but the cartoon basically conveys the way we think the world works. That if we make a plot that has fishing effort on one axis, so basically how many hours are we fishing, how many vessels are fishing, how many sort of traps are we putting in the ocean, however we want to measure the effort that we're putting into this, what are the landings that we get out of that? How many fish are we harvesting? Okay. Well, if we're not fishing at all, then we're not going to get any fish. So there has to be zero there. And at some point, if we're thinking about this as sort of a long-term average, at some point we're fishing so much that we collapse the fishery, so we don't catch any fish that way either. And so there has to be some sort of middle point where the amount of fishing effort we're putting in is just right. The fish population can still replace itself, and we can maintain landings over time. We could draw a similar graphic for the relationship between fishery landings and the proportion of habitat that's in reserves. So we could imagine if the fishery is not managed very well and we're over harvesting, then maybe setting aside some of those fishing grounds and reserves allows fish biomass to build up. And so adding reserve area could actually benefit the fishery. We protect some of those fish, they get big, they make a lot of babies, those babies go out into the fished area, and you can have enhanced landings. But of course, if you close off most of the fishing grounds or all the fishing grounds, then there's just no place to catch fish. And so fishing yield has to decline. Alternatively, if the fishery outside is very well managed, it's managed conservatively and sustainably, then adding reserve area will just always decrease fishing yield because you're just closing off places where people would be fishing sustainably anyway. Okay, so it turns out that the effect of reserves on fishery yields, on the fishery economy, depends a lot on how fishery management works, right? There are other aspects of the way fisheries and reserves work that we need to think about that are sort of current areas of research. For example, one really key question we're trying to answer right now in the fisheries management world is when we do fisheries management, we estimate how much biomass is in the fishery, and we try to keep that above some level, right? We want to make sure the biomass doesn't get too low, so the fishery stock is getting so small that we worry about it. The question is, as we have more protected areas in the ocean, and these include marine reserves, these could include offshore wind areas where you're not allowed to fish, how do you count that biomass and make sure that that goes into our estimate of what the entire fishery stock is doing, so we're not just locking away fish on fishing grounds and then saying that, okay, we can't count that extra fish biomass when we decide how healthy the fishery is, right? So how do we do that math of knowing that we're trying to manage the fish part of the population while keeping track of how many fish are in the protected area? How do we do that? That's an active area of research and an active area of debate in management agencies. There's also an opportunity potentially, because part of fishery management is always comparing what the population looks like now to what an unfished population looks like, to know how much fishing have we done. And so if reserves can eventually look like an unfished population with lots of big old fish, maybe we could use that as a reference point to say, like, okay, how far away from that are we? And that'll tell us how much we're exploiting the fishery. So there's a lot of opportunities here and really a lot of extra research to be done. So to try to answer the question that I posed on my title slide, there's a balancing act between protecting ecosystems and reserves and maintaining fisheries. In general, when we have a really well-managed fishery system, we're unlikely to see fishery benefits of reserves. That's just the reality, right? But there are opportunities to combine reserve management and conventional management to both minimize harm to fisheries and potentially find ways of benefiting fisheries. And even if we step aside from fisheries, there are some non-fishery benefits of reserves that are worth considering when we think about what they're trying to accomplish, right? You get bigger fish, there's more reproduction. There's some mechanisms by which they could provide some resilience in the face of climate change, keeping in mind that there are time lags in the expected realization of some of those benefits. It takes time for fish to get old. It takes time for fish to get big before we can see those benefits. And the types of benefits you can see depend a lot on the fishery ecosystem and what we call the life history of those fish, right? Is this a system like we have in California, where there's a big fish species or a lobster that eats sea urchins, and so by protecting an ecosystem and a reserve, we can get more things that will eat urchins? That's not really something that happens in Oregon. So that could be a success story in California, but not something we expect to see here. And so we have to keep in mind the natural history and the ecology of these systems in order to understand what kind of effects we're likely to see, what kind of benefits we're likely to see. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening and for attending this webinar. And of course, I'd like to thank all of the agencies and foundations that have funded my research into these types of questions over the years. I've put some links to my unit's website and to my personal lab website, and then I'm on social media and things like that. And you are welcome to follow me and reach out there. And thank you very much for listening. I'll stop sharing now.
Awesome. Big thanks to Will for the awesome presentation. That was so great. So now we're going to go into questions and answers. So if you have any burning questions, now is your chance to ask. So you have two options. You can either put your questions in the chat and we'll go through and ask for you, or you can raise your hand. And if you'd rather unmute and ask the question that way, we'll be monitoring that as well. So have at it, folks. Whoops. No questions yet, so I'm gonna kick it off if that's okay.
Yeah, I also wanted to put in I don't know if the chat is active, but
You can drop it in the Q&A or the chat.
I don't think I can actually ask a question. Maybe I'll just put this here for you and you can share it as you see fit. But I wanted to give a big shout out to the ODFW Marine Reserves Program. They have a really great website that has lots of data and visualizations and lots of information on every reserve up and down the coast. And so if you're interested in details about the particulars of each of those 5 reserves, that's a really great resource.
Absolutely, I echo that. There's also a really great Flixer page where you can look at awesome marine reserve photos, and we definitely use that page to get a lot of content for social media stuff. All right, we have our first question. So Dawn asked, do you find that predators move into protected areas?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thanks, Don. So not so again, this is one of these questions that depends on the species and the system that you're talking about. But one sort of on the US West Coast, one species that it's not really they move in. It's not like they see a dinner buffet and are like, here, let's get into it. But lingcod, which many of you may know, is this delicious fish we have here in Oregon that gets big, and they have a giant mouth and they eat lots of other fish. And so they are protected in reserves, and that means that you get big, large predators in the reserves, and they are eating the other fish that we're also protecting. And so there's some data emerging that as we protect some of these areas, you get lots of lingcod, but that means you don't get as many rockfish, let's say, as you might otherwise expect, because you have that predator-prey interaction. So that's a great question.
Mhm. How does this affect reproduction of species that are trying to be saved?
Yeah, so I'm taking that as a sort of a follow-up, and yeah, so it does sort of inhibit, I guess, the protections of the other species. Although, of course, you might want to think about that in terms of what did these systems look like before we started fishing them? We had big lingcod. We maybe because we had big lingcod, we didn't have as many giant rockfish. So that yeah, that's right. Yeah, as you return to a more unfished state, you get those interactions emerging.
Thanks, Will. So the next question is, how does Oregon's marine reserve system compare to Washington's and California's?
Yeah, so that's a great question too. So California system is pretty different. So I'll say they're similar in the sense that a lot of the same scientific guidance was used to design both sets of reserves. In fact, so I was part of the California design process, and way back in 2008, even before I became, didn't even dream of being a professor in Oregon at that time. But I was down in California, and I came up to the Oregon Institute of Marine Biology and was part of a panel that sort of gave some insights on marine reserve science and how that would affect the design of Oregon's marine reserves. I think the biggest difference is that in California, the enabling legislation that formed California's Marine Reserve Network specifically said that it has to work as a network. It's a network of marine reserves. And so the whole thing was built on, we need to have reserves that are sort of connected by, let's say, the movement of larvae over ocean currents, and they need to be close enough together that you have those connections. And we need to have replication across different habitats and things like that. And they were thought of as an entire piece at one time. Whereas in Oregon, the perspective was we have this really diverse coastline with diverse coastal communities, and we should have different reserves that are suited to the needs of those different communities. And so in Oregon, the way the process was developed was that different community groups got together and proposed for their particular area, and those had different goals and different plans for what they would accomplish, right? So down in Port Orford, you have Redfish Rocks. They were really interested in closing off this area that had been fairly heavily fished and enhancing the fishery down there. In other areas, like in Otter Rock, the goal was more like, let's protect this special habitat, you know, even though we're not doing a lot of fishing there.
That's a great answer. It's very nuanced. So how are reserves
Right,
protected?
and that affects the way you evaluate.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, that's fine. Yeah, I was just saying that, you know, thinking about the goals of the things, it leads you to think about how you want to evaluate whether they're effective or not. All right, so how are the reserves protected from fishermen? I mean, essentially, you can't fish in the reserves, right? And so the you know, law enforcement monitors those areas and will you know, cite you if you're caught poaching. Although I think I've shown that really the fish populations and our ecosystems, they're linked. It's not like you can just put a wall around a marine reserve. What's happening in all parts of the ocean affects what's going on in that reserve, and what's happening in the reserve affects the fish population as well.
All right, so Brad Bailey asks, as water temp will continue to rise, we continue to lose our kelp. The reserves will become urchin barrens with loss of biodiversity. So how do we address this problem?
Yeah, that's a big concern. And all these climate effects are one of the next big questions. So I have a number of research projects going on right now that are basically tailored to that question so we're forecasting climate effects and those effects on kelp populations and urchin populations and the fish populations that depend on them, and asking, you know, are there ways we can adjust management to respond to that? And I think, you know, the answer ultimately is that there are some restoration activities that we can do. You know, we can go out and basically smash up urchins and try to enable kelp populations to take hold. But I think, you know, ultimately, unfortunately, the answer for kelp forests in these temperate areas is kind of the same as the answer for coral reefs that we're worried about, that this is a global problem. And so we have to reduce carbon emissions to reverse some of the effects of climate change before we are going to see, you know, good long-term outcomes for those ecosystems.
Absolutely. Speaking of climate change, how might wind energy off the Oregon coast impact our marine reserve system? Any concerns there?
Yeah, it turns out I've got a research project working on that as well right now. So it's important to know that the wind energy that's currently being proposed by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is often federal waters, right? So the Oregon marine reserves are all in state waters. They're really close to shore. Those wind energy call areas are further offshore. So they're really targeting a very different part of the ocean, a different part of the continental shelf. There are likely to be some fishery impacts, although it's my understanding from keeping an eye on the process that the way the agencies are adjusting the areas that they're, you know, devoting to wind energy are trying to minimize a lot of those fishery impacts as much as possible, trying to avoid wind energy areas in places where a lot of fishing effort happens. There's some concern that there could be some effects on the upwelling ecosystem, right? So if you block the wind, then you block the driving force that brings cold, nutrient-rich water up from the surface. My understanding of of those results is that you have to have really big wind farms to have effects that are that intense. And it's not really so much of a stopping upwelling, it's more of a moving where it happens in space. And so I think that's probably less of a concern given what I know of that science right now. Yeah, I think that's my answer.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. All right, so Eva wants to know, so Eva's working as the Rocky Habitats Project Coordinator for the Oregon Coastal Management Program. What kind of biological implications have you seen between rocky habitats and marine reserves? Do they support one another when they're nearby or overlapping? And how can we measure the success of smaller intertidal organisms?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and it's one of these cases where we have to think about what do the regulations around the marine reserves do, right? We don't have commercial harvest of very many intertidal things, right? So there's some places along the Pacific coast where there is their active harvest of things like sea palms and things like that. To my knowledge, we don't have that in California. So we don't have that. That's a thing in California. We don't have that in Oregon. So I don't think that is a direct effect. But it's worth thinking about. Our marine reserves places where now more people are going to go visit those rocky intertidal habitats, and maybe there's more, human use and more visitation and more people sort of tromping around in the intertidal. Like me, it's possible to think about there being actually kind of a negative effect on some types of rocky intertidal habitats just because it becomes a place where we have more people going to see the ocean. But I think this is one of those cases where you have to think pretty hard about what does the protection do in terms of how it would change human use of that system.
That's a great answer to that question. Thank you. I have a burning question, if I may.
Yeah.
Would you mind explaining the difference between a marine reserve, a marine protected area, marine sanctuaries, marine gardens? Like there's so many different types of classifications. I think people get kind of confused about the differences.
Yes, I would prefer not to answer that question. No, so this is something that it varies with whatever the local jurisdiction is. And so that's something that every state has different definitions for these things. Every nation has different definitions of these. So in the sort of scientific literature, we use marine protected area as sort of this umbrella phrase that means anywhere where in the ocean there's some space where there's a particular regulation. But that can vary from, okay, you can't do mineral exploration there, but you can still fish, to, humans can't go there, right? That there's this whole spectrum of things you can and can't do. Typically, we use the word marine reserve to mean places where you can't harvest anything. And that's the way Oregon uses that term. We also have marine protected areas in Oregon where some uses are permitted, and those are sort of adjacent to marine reserves. But then, marine sanctuary, we have at the federal level, we have the National Marine Sanctuary Program, and national marine sanctuaries have a variety of regulations. Typically, they exclude things that modify the seabed, so you can't do, oil and gas sort of stuff. And usually you can fish there, but that varies as to what you can do in a sanctuary. And then also, yeah, you have like marine gardens and marine parks and marine conservation areas. And that's just like, you can't know just from the name what those things are unless you ask like, okay, what's the regulation? What's actually happening here?
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to go look at the website for the marine reserves and see like what specifically the regulations are for each site. So Brad wants to know, Oni Sea Farm is harvesting purple urchins and planting kelp. Is there possibly a way to help in the reserves to remove the purple urchins before they turn into barrens?
Yeah, we'd like to think so, right? I think that's one of the goals of that type of operation. Historically, the purple urchins are too small to be commercially valuable so if you don't know, the main reason to harvest urchins is that we like to eat their gonads. They're uni in seafood. And usually it's the red urchins that are harvested because they're bigger and they have bigger gonads. And the purples haven't been really commercially viable. But there is this effort to either do what we call like sea ranching, where you go out and collect urchins out in the wild, bring them into an aquaculture facility, feed them a lot of kelp that you've grown in aquaculture, and then market them. Or plant kelp and hope that the kelp can grow in the wild. And that's one of these things where we can plant a lot of kelp, but if the environmental conditions aren't good for supporting kelp, that's not going to be successful in the long term, right? And so we have these interventions we can do, and we're trying to find ways to make them work. But those are very much in the experimental stage. I would say if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to check out the website of the Oregon Kelp Alliance. That's ORCA, ORKA. They're a nonprofit that's doing a lot of work in that space, in collaboration with a lot of Oregon State researchers as well.
Thanks, Will. So next question. In your presentation, you mentioned an invasive species that is negatively impacting our kelp beds. What is it? How did it get here, and when did it arrive?
Yeah, thanks for that clarifying question. That is an invasive species in Southern California, so it's not affecting our Oregon kelp beds. It's a seaweed called Sargassum. Sargassum horneri is the specific. There's a lot of different Sargassum out there. This is Sargassum horneri. It arrived back in the early 2010s, I want to say, and I am not sure how it got introduced, but it's, there's only the usual ways are somebody had it in their aquarium and then they tossed it out in the ocean, or it came in, like a shipping container, sort of like in ballast water sort of thing. But I'm not actually sure we know how it invaded. But I'm not an expert in that algal species, so I don't want to speculate too much.
Any other questions?
Thank you for all the great questions.
All right, and you can also reach out to Dr. Will White directly. I can drop his email in the chat. Give it just a minute more for questions. All right, going once, going twice. Last chance, everyone. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to Will. All right, so that will conclude our Q&A. So much appreciation for the great presentation. So somebody in the chat, and I echo that. Thank you so much, Will.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Okay, so I just wanted to start some closing remarks with some awesome news for our marine reserves. Will talked about it already, but earlier this month, the Oregon State Legislature passed the bipartisan Marine Reserve Bill. It passed almost entirely unanimously in the House and the Senate, chiefly sponsored by Representative David Gomberg, who's shown in this picture, along with several of our colleagues from the Bird Alliance of Oregon, Surfrider, and the Oregon League of Conservation Voters. And yeah, this new law restores lost funding that was cut out of the Marine Reserves Program budget during the 2023 legislative session, but it also directs ODFW to implement the recommendations that was made by OSU's decadal review of the Marine Reserves Program. So that'll include implementing an adaptive management plan for the program to help adapt to changing ocean conditions, and also a social monitoring program to expand community and tribal engagement. So we're just super happy to see the state invest in these really important marine conservation areas, and we're just super excited about the future of the marine program. So I just wanted to call that out Big thanks to everybody who testified and contacted their representatives to help support the bill. We definitely couldn't have done it without you. So I just wanted to thank you all for that. Okay. Oops. Sorry. And then also, one thing that you can do to continue to support our marine reserves, it's really important to thank the Coastal Caucus and the representatives who supported the bill and helped pass it through the legislature. This will help keep the momentum going when future ocean bills land on their desk, and they'll remember that their constituents really care about our marine environment. So if you feel like it would be really great to contact your legislators and just thank them for making sure that this bill passed. You can also visit our awesome marine reserves, particularly in the summer. They're great areas to go tide pooling and whale watch. And you can learn more about the specific reserve boundaries and regulations around harvesting fish, invertebrates, and seaweeds on the Oregon Marine Reserves website, which I will drop in the chat again. It's a super great resource to learn everything about the decadal review, as well as view pictures and learn about the regulations surrounding the reserves. And then also you can come celebrate World Oceans Day with us. Both ASLC and Oregon Shores will be at the Oregon Coast Aquarium in Newport tabling, so come say hi. And I just want to thank you all for joining. It was really great to see so many people show up to learn about marine reserves. Thank you so much to Will again for giving such an awesome presentation and explaining the science behind marine reserves and why they work and the impacts they have on fisheries. That was truly a deep dive and I appreciate it. And then you can learn more about our organizations and sign up for our newsletters to stay in the loop about our work by visiting our respective websites for the Audubon Society of Lincoln City and Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition. We also have, our organizations have social media accounts where you can stay connected and learn about all the ways you can get involved in marine conservation. You can also volunteer, donate, take action. If you stay in the loop and follow what we're doing, we provide all kinds of tools to get involved. So thank you again for coming to our webinar and have a great evening. Also, I am going to be sending out the recording link in next week. So keep an eye out for that if you want to share with your friends and colleagues. Kent, do you have any final thoughts? Kent's having some audio troubles. Unfortunately, the Wi-Fi outage on the coast has been kind of a nightmare today. So big thanks to everyone. And we will catch you next time. Have a good evening. Bye.